I would like to pass the button to our next speaker. Simon Pettman is here. He is Executive Director at the International Alliance of Dietary Food Supplement Association, and he will inform you about legal frameworks, very welcome, for food supplements worldwide. How did they develop? Where are the similarities? Where are the differences? We are very pleased to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's quite hard to be the next speaker. All I'm doing is thinking about all the asparagus I've eaten over the last couple of months and the damage I've done. But still, it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to very much thank BFR and BVL for the invitation. I think the last time I was here was for a Codex Nutrition Committee quite a number of years ago, where actually supplements are due to be on the agenda. I think the agenda was very tight and they weren't discussed at the end of the day, but that was progress towards the Codex Vitamin and Mineral Supplement Guideline. I've been asked today to speak a little bit about the global regulatory framework for food supplements outside Europe. We've heard a lot about the regulatory framework within Europe, but we know we live in a global marketplace, and we know that many products are traded across borders, particularly now with e-commerce. So it's important to understand not just the regulation that exists outside the European Union, but also some of the cultural issues that lie behind this. And hopefully this will give a little bit more of an understanding of the questions that are being addressed, whether it's supplements or it's superfoods. So I just want to firstly, and this is brief introduction of some of the key milestones in regulation globally. I'm just going to go to the first one, which is 1994, actually DSHEA, not DHSEA, which was 28 years old, which in the US. And I think it's a very important piece of legislation, not just because the US is the largest global market, but also because it was one of the first times there's specific legislation on supplements in any major country. There was regulation, there's no doubt, in countries, but nothing of this scale and nothing which was so, let's say, focused in this area as DSHEA was. 2002, 20 years ago, hence the fireworks. There was the Food Supplement Directive, still is the Food Supplement Directive. And that was a very key point because it actually clarified the term food supplements in law, and it defined food supplements, and we'll come back to that in a minute. 2005, as I've just mentioned, the guidelines for vitamin and mineral food supplements, hugely influential. I have to say, after the Codex guidelines on vitamins and mineral supplements, my travel rose exponentially as governments realized across the world that they needed to make sure they worked to build their regulatory frameworks. And I think it's sometimes why we're doing a little bit this storyline of the dates is to show that still over the last 20, 30 years, there's been considerable evolution across the world, particularly in major markets. And that has been stimulated also by those Codex guidelines and still is today. 2006. This was in India, just in case you don't recognize what that country is, a bit of geography lesson here. Food Safety and Standards Act of 2006, which really established in India again today one of the major suppliers of food ingredients to the world. It established health supplements and nutraceuticals as terms within the legislation, but it would be some years before the specific regulatory framework came into place. But that was the first time there was a legal category. And then we jump a bit ahead to the agreement in ASEAN. So ASEAN, 10 countries of Southeast Asia, more than 600 million people, and they agreed 10 technical annexes, we could call vertical annexes, around supplements in 2015. And then also, I just want to mention one last one, is the China. It's very important. Again, a major supplier of products, major supplier of ingredients. And there was an all-round review of food safety and the creation of this food safety law of the People's Republic in 2015, into which a definition of health foods was incorporated, and that had become the baseline from which other legislation has been developed. It still existed before. Health foods existed as a category, but this changed the framework for that piece of regulation. I said it was the last one, but that's because I'm just going to cover in a detail of two more. One is, this is the specific rules in India, which were agreed in 2016 for health supplements, nutraceuticals, and other categories, which would be food for specific purposes here in Europe. And then, here we go, in the coming months, I talked about the 10 annexes of ASEAN, all these 10 annexes, and these should be bolted on to an agreement on health supplements, which we're expecting to be signed by the heads of state in September, October of this year. So a little bit, I want to show that evolution, and there are pieces of that evolution. I've just covered some markets, but we have there almost 50% of the planet's population just within those countries. And I could show an overview of Latin America, and there would be a similar evolution and same kind of description of what's happening in Asia. But a question then we're asking ourselves, so what has triggered some of this? And I think it's worth just looking at 3 examples of what triggered. So first of all, I just want to address the US. And this is a common question. Why DSHEA? Why do we have DSHEA? You know, why is it that type of law? And I think what I didn't fully understand until we actually started to develop a series of publications on the history of some of these regulations that actually came out of the Nutrition Labeling Education Act, where it was passed in 1990, and it gave the right to make nutrient-related health claims. But what they realized when they created that it could also include other ingredients. And there were many other ingredients on the market, and that would involve also dietary supplements. So a task force was set up to investigate the dietary supplement category and produced a report recommending ways to regulate it. And it concluded, while vitamins and minerals were of no concern, herbs should potentially be addressed as food additives. So in the same category as artificial sweeteners and synthetic flavors, and other ingredients would also be regulated in such ways. So this led to a reaction, I have to say, a broad reaction, not just a reaction of producers who had products on the market, of consumers who are consuming them. It also resulted in a reaction from very well-known Hollywood actors such as Mel Gibson, who was a supplement user, and they said this can't be right. And Congress and Senate therefore worked together in a very short time frame of 2 years to develop the Dietary Supplement Health Education Act. And I think that's interesting because it shows how sometimes these pathways happen. India, on the other hand, it was really stimulated by controversy over levels of pesticide residues in food and beverage products. There's a little bit of similarities with what stimulated the change of food law in Europe and the creation of EFSA. In 2006, India's new food legislation, the Food Safety Standards Act, was adopted, and it provided that framework for the consolidation of Indians' food laws. And this is very important. It also created the Food Safety Standards Authority of India, and because there was a category of supplements and nutraceuticals, sorry, I keep looking at nutraceuticals, in the regulation, then they had to work out how they were going to develop that regulation. They therefore created a scientific panel which would then report to the FSSAI on how that regulation or the scientific underpinning for the category. I'll come back to that a little later. A third type of approach to triggering supplement legislation really comes out of what happened in ASEAN. And here in ASEAN was a little bit realizing that the EU was maybe getting ahead. They have a big neighbor to the northeast who they felt was a big competitor, let's say in economic terms, China, and they wanted to create the economies of scale. So they said, what are our strategic sectors? Forestry, rubber, cars, what else? And they said, we will develop a harmonized single market in pharmaceuticals, we will aim to harmonize in food, but we will focus a lot of activity in traditional medicines and health supplements. And they created a single working group of governments, sometimes both food and pharmaceutical authorities sitting together, which over a period of time, and this was back in 2004, over time, then has developed this model. So for them, and this was very clear, they considered, certainly at that point, not just the need to ensure consumer protection, fair labeling, etc., but also that this sector, these two sectors, traditional medicines and health supplements, were important strategically for the region. They were major growth areas. So, we talk a lot about influencers today. I'm not sure what the word in German probably is, influencer, or is it? Yes. No. So we talk about influencers, but what are the influencers today in regulatory terms? I'm sure in government you'll like to be influencers, of course. So it's your job to be influenced, to write the regulation to influence. So we have, first of all, I want to go through a number of key areas and say who in a way is key in terms of this globally. On the definition, I mentioned the European Food Supplement Directive. And there's no doubt that the EU has remained, or the Food Supplement Directive has remained, an absolutely critical document worldwide because largely of its definition. Because of the way it's stated within the Food Supplement Directive, the substances with a nutritional, physiological effect. It's not just vitamins, minerals, it's other ingredients. And capture the diverse nature of the products which were used in supplements. So that's a very important, and that remains so, and you will find that terminology throughout the world, and it largely came out of the EU. A second influencer, which is very important, is quality. And here, in DSHE, it stated that there would be a specific supplement, GMP, would be developed for dietary supplements, and this came about in 2007. And this has become almost a passport for US companies because US GMP is recognized by many countries across the world as that entry point for products coming into their markets. And it is interesting that many other countries following this, whether it's ASEAN, whether it's India, whether it's Korea, have now developed also, they've had their GMP stand specifically for supplements. Now, of course, in Europe, there are manufacturing requirements, it's HACCP, but there are some certain specificities of supplements, of tablets and capsules, which make the whole concept of supplement GMP actually quite relevant and, of course, attractive both governments and also to industry and therefore to consumers. Claims. Now, it's a little bit more complicated because the world it's harder to find a common approach on claims worldwide because of the diversity, because of the systems, but certainly Codex remains the very important reference point. And of course, the EU permitted list of claims is one of the first reference points governments look at. Now, I just want to address the vitamins and minerals. There's no doubt, and it's been mentioned, the sources and forms of vitamins and minerals in the Food Supplement Directive are worldwide. That is a reference list. It's a very important list. But when we come to the establishment of maximum levels, something which has not been addressed yet, or completed, the work has not been completed within the EU, ASEAN is starting to move beyond that. In fact, they've agreed their harmonization of maximum levels of vitamins and minerals based on the approach which is in the Codex supplement guideline, and actually with the same approach which is incorporated into Article 5 of the Food Supplement Directive. So those are the levels which have been agreed, and of course, when you look across the world at the actual UL, the tolerable upper level, then you'll find there's common agreement between, in general, we'll see what EFSA develops in terms of reviewed opinion, its new opinions when they come out next year, but between people like the Institute of Nutrition, EFSA, the Indian ICMR, UK EVM, and others in terms of the TUL. The max level, of course, can vary according to the country and based on that approach which is put out there by Codex and is incorporated in the Supplement Directive. And in broad terms, this is the closest we got to implementation of this in a major market at the moment. Botanicals, India. Now, I saw Ayurveda was mentioned. Ayurveda is very important. I don't need to say. There was a ministry of Ayush, a ministry of Ayurveda in India. Historically, that primarily addressed Ayurvedic medicines. Not today. It doesn't yet. It also addresses Ayurvedic foods. And in fact, on the 5th of May, a new piece of legislation was tabled by the government of India, by the FSSAI, which would actually, it creates a new category called Ayush Ahara, which is Ayurvedic foods. Why is this? This is because they believe this is their national heritage, and they believe this tradition should be integrated in the new ways of consumption. They're not undermining the Ayurvedic medicine tradition. This is still very important. But they want to make sure that that Ayurvedic tradition is moving forward with the way consumers are operating today. So this is an important piece of legislation. I encourage you to lead that. But just coming back to the supplement piece, because that's for foods in general, in supplements, in the regulations that exist, there is an annex with a range of botanicals which can be used, and many of those come from an Ayurvedic tradition. So that is integrated within the Indian health supplement nutraceutical regulations. And I think just at this point, I think it is worth making, and I said to the organizer that I mentioned some of the cultural points of what we face. When I sort of go to Asia or other places, particularly in Asia and also Latin America, and we're talking through the supplement category, we're talking about vitamins and minerals. Botanicals are quite deep. This is where the tradition, they have a much greater daily knowledge of the use of botanicals just in their food. It's not the big, if I can call it, the big separation that we see certainly in the West. And therefore, this is a normal evolution. So when we look at the integration of this in India, and we look at Ayush Ahara, this goes to the very top of government. That's why it's there. It's that level. And I think that's worth bearing in mind. I see similarities with Turkey. This goes to the very top. When Cynthia, who's in the audience with me from IADS, we met with the Indian ministry in Ankara a while back, and they said, we have biodiversity, we have more botanicals in our country than the whole of the EU put together. That is important for us. That, in a way, is what our contribution should be. And I think it's culturally, that's very important that we understand that. I understand the issues, and we'll come back to that, but culturally it's very important. So, market access, very important. What does this involve? And we have the EU notification system, groundbreaking. To be honest, when it was introduced, I thought, how's this going to work? We had some countries of Central Europe had moved from a registration system to notification. How is this going to work? You know what? I believe it's worked reasonably well. That would be my view. But I think it's worked very well in terms of encouraging countries across the world to actually introduce an equivalent type of system. And I'll briefly mention post-market surveillance reporting as Canada, USA, Korea, and there's also France, who's developed the nutri-vigilance system or the SAR system in the US. That's very important, but I haven't got time to go into detail on that. So I just want to come back to this question of registration and notification. I actually want to start with China because I think it's very relevant. China historically had only a registration system, and it could take 2 years. It could cost a lot of money to put your product through testing, and any company who has tried to bring a product to market and get this blue hat will understand what that means. And it could even take longer than 2 years. The problem was there was an easier way to get products on the market, which is to put them on as general foods. And so much of the market of supplements was actually products were put on the market as general foods, which meant they weren't following the logical regulatory framework, which was confusing, creating challenges for the regulator, and I think creating challenges, I have to say, in international trade. After plenty of discussions with what was then the SFDA in China, now the SAMR, a listing system was introduced, and I have to say the EU system was very important in moving them towards a lighter approach. And now the percentage, I haven't got precise figures of how many products are now moving away from being general foods, but moving into this listing system, but it's jumped enormously. So we have the bulk of the market, significant numbers who now would have gone through that general food approach and now going through the listing system, which is closer to, say, the notification system in the EU than the registration system. So I think that's important because it helped the authorities to ensure control and enforcement because they have now more oversight. Turkey, I mentioned very briefly. They were moving to implement the EU legislation. They wanted to put a registration process in place. It didn't work. Tried many examples, it didn't work. And we actually ended up working with the government there to support the development of their system around notification because they had the logjam. And I think this is part of the problem with the registration systems where they can be introduced. There simply aren't the capacity within the government or to actually make this work. And then the requirements are it just becomes onerous for both sides or all sides in the process. So they're now with a notification system, which I believe is working pretty well. So this is the picture we now face across the world. So anything in blue has some kind of pre-market control. That means before the product is on the market, it has to go through a notification system, a listing system, a registration system of some nature. Some are light registration, soft registration. Some of those involve the claims evaluation as well. But broadly, that's the map. And many of the countries which are in grey is simply because we don't know at this time what the system is. I think it's worth mentioning the ones in red, and they're not in red for any sort of alarmist sort of approach. They're in red because the US currently is looking at, before Congress and Senate, there is a proposal for a mandatory listing system for supplements. This has been called for by industry for at least the last 5-10 years, where they said we need to have that so there's transparency for what's in the market. Because for the industry, it also doesn't work if products are on the market which are making illegal medicinal claims. Of course it doesn't. It's about reputation and trust in consumers and relationships with government. I also referenced there the harmonizing region of the Pacific Alliance with that sort of multicolored flower logo. And there they're also looking at a form of notification or sort of system, pre-market system, but it's not in place for the region yet. So briefly, I'd just like to look at EU and ASEAN, and you'll, I'm sure, get these slides, so I don't need to spend long, but I thought it'd be useful because ASEAN is very comparable, in a sense, the only comparable region to the EU, to show what is happening within ASEAN. So we have these 10 annexes. We have a negative list, the principles of use of additives, contaminants, TSE, BSE. We have stability and shelf life, going all the way through to maximum levels of vitamins and minerals. So these are all developed, and within the group there is an equivalent list for traditional medicines. Slightly different, of course, different annexes, but still there is a list, and that's being developed. So if we look at this, we see population. Okay, ASEAN's got higher population, less countries. We got a directive in the EU, an agreement in ASEAN. It's vertical and horizontal legislation that we've seen. In the EU, it's just vertical rules, so to speak, specific rules for supplements in ASEAN. And there is harmonization, so to speak, in Europe. That means people follow the same rules where they exist. Whereas in ASEAN, because they don't have a court of justice, because they don't have mutual recognition principle enshrined in law like there is in EU, it's convergence. But it's convergence where everybody has to accept those annexes, what's in those annexes. And they can be a bit more liberal if they want, but they cannot be more restrictive unless it's being defined within that agreement. we're here today and we're talking about, I think we're talking also not just about superfoods and we're talking about supplements, we're also talking about some of the challenges that exist in the marketplace and some of the problems. And when I saw one of the products, I was thinking, that has to go. We need that off. That has to go immediately. Is it illegal food? Is it illegal medicine? Is it illegal food supplement? Whatever it is, it's illegal. It should go. Even the labeling was wrong before I even get to whatever might be in some of the ingredient panel. And I think the question is how you go about this. And this is a bit, I know from my work within the sector, that this is one of the biggest frustrations of the sector, is people who are making, for example, medicinal claims for products, illegal claims. It drives people crazy because it's unfair competition. I also know from the work with governments that that's also their frustration. And I just want to give you an example of something which we've worked on, actually in India, where you saw in 2016 the new regulations were created. And we sat down, it's sort of a meeting where we didn't know what was going to happen. And the CEO of the Food Safety Authority said, can we create a resource center? And if we create a resource center on health supplements and nutraceuticals, can we make sure we can get best international practice and experts to help support this work? And we said, yes. RECAM was created also with support from the Confederation of Indian Industry, provided secretariat. And that has worked closely with the government on a whole series of programs, both on compliance with the regulation, on the development of GMP, on training around GMP, but also on training around enforcement, implementation, etc. So, for example, training of point of sale, the supplements and nutraceuticals, training sessions with the major internet providers in India, with Amazon and others. There's also working with the Institute of Food Technology to try and build their knowledge of the regulations and compliance, etc. And then we have, on the bottom left, we have the training session with Apollo Pharmacies. Now, I don't know if you recognize any of the faces there, probably not, but on the right, at the bottom, that is the chair of the Food Safety Standards Authority of India, who has come to that meeting with a major chain of pharmacies in India to tell them that this is important for the government, that they are fully trained on the regulation, on what they can sell, what they can't sell, what to look for, what the standards are, etc. On the left of your screen, these people, this includes both the CEO of the Food Safety Authority, FSSAI, and also includes the Minister of Health, who is supporting the training, the consumer awareness of the training programs and point of sale on World Food Safety Day. And I think, just to give that as an illustration, the words of the CEO when he spoke to us, he said, I only believe that by working together, we can really work this out, so to speak. So do I have your commitment to support? And that's where we committed. And subject, obviously, to the restrictions of COVID and travel, I think it's made quite a lot of progress. So I'd just like to leave there. I'd say here are a whole series of regulatory, I call them history of regulation. We call them internally regulatory stories because we feel that you need to understand what a bit the storyline behind different regulations. Each one has been developed with or by someone who was intimately involved in that process. So we have Codex, the guidelines, which was the first one we developed, is ASEAN's road to harmonization, India's food regulations, which then led into the health supplement regulations. We call it EU's defining moment because of the definition. And the most recent one, very US-type term, the pioneering US dietary supplement law, because you say we put it at the beginning of that chain of choreography. So I'd just like to say, if anybody would like one of those, we'll send them to the organizers, but if you'd like one, please let us know and we'll send them to you. We don't put them in the public domain, but we're very happy to send those to you. But we certainly use those, we give those out to, of course, our membership and to governments and other key stakeholders in the process. And also, if you're looking for that, please look at our website. because we have our code of ethics, which is a very important document, and I think I'd just like everybody to appreciate that as the supplement sector, we also are fully committed to delivering products which are legal and are ethical and deliver the benefits that they promise. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simon Pettman, for giving us the industry perspective on this issue.